The front door didn't just open that afternoon, it detonated. The sound of it slamming into the wall reverberated through the house like a gunshot, shaking the picture frames that lined the hallway. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause, caught in the violent stillness between shock and disbelief. A woman stood in the doorway, framed by the blinding glow of the afternoon sun. Her crisp blazer was pinned with a golden badge that read HOA President, and her expression burned with the kind of self-righteous fury that could peel paint off walls. In one hand, she gripped a clipboard like a weapon. In the other, a cell phone already recording. She didn't knock. She didn't announce herself. She just marched inside, through the living room, past the kitchen, eyes darting across countertops and furniture as if she were searching for contraband. I stood frozen, the mug in my hand trembling, watching this stranger invade my home as if she owned it. Her heels clicked across the tile, sharp and deliberate. The smell of her perfume cut through the air, sterile and commanding, as though even the scent demanded authority. "This is the third violation this month," she snapped, though I hadn't asked a single question. Her voice cracked through the silence like lightning. "Your lawn is non-compliant. Your garbage can's visible too long in your mailbox. Don't get me started." She didn't know whose house she'd just entered. She didn't know the person standing before her wasn't some helpless homeowner afraid of HOA letters and neighborhood whispers. She didn't know I'd spent 20 years staring down criminals who made her kind of arrogance look small. When I finally spoke, the words came slow, even, and cold. "Ma'am," I said, "you need to leave now." What happened next turned a petty neighborhood feud into a story that would make national headlines. It exposed a system of power and paranoia that had been brewing behind white fences and manicured lawns for years, and ended with handcuffs, flashing lights, and a reckoning no one saw coming, because sometimes, when people like her believe they're untouchable, they forget one thing. What happens when the person they try to control is the law itself? In the quiet suburb of Willow Creek, everything looked perfect on the surface. Rows of immaculate lawns shimmered in the morning dew, white fences gleamed under the sun, and every driveway showcased cars that seemed freshly washed, polished, and parked with surgical precision. It was the kind of neighborhood that real estate brochures dream about. Clean, orderly, and serene. But beneath that flawless exterior lay a web of tension, pride, and silent rivalries waiting to erupt. Laura Bennett had moved here for peace. After years in the city, she wanted quiet evenings, a garden to tend, and neighbors who waved from across the street. Her home sat at the end of Birchwood Lane, a 2-story colonial with blue shutters, ivy creeping along the stone wall, and a small vegetable patch in the back she cared for like it was her child. Every morning she would sip her coffee by the kitchen window, watching the neighborhood slowly awaken. Sprinklers turning on, joggers passing by, children on bikes racing toward the park. It was peaceful, predictable, and safe. At least, that's what she thought. The Homeowners Association, known simply as the Board, was the beating heart of Willow Creek, or, depending on who you asked, its iron fist. It was made up of 5 members, each with their own brand of control. Karen Holloway, the president, was the type of woman who could smile while sharpening a knife. Her short blonde bob never moved out of place, her lipstick was always perfect, and her tone carried the subtle authority of someone used to getting their way. Next was Greg Tolman, the treasurer, an ex-accountant who treated HOA budgets like state secrets. He spoke mostly in numbers and rules, finding comfort in regulations others found suffocating. Then came Pam and Robert Lane, a married couple who seemed pleasant enough in public, but constantly whispered behind neighbors' backs. The last member, Steve Daniels, was quiet but observant, the kind of man who never took a side but always knew which way the wind was blowing. At first, Laura thought the HOA was harmless, a necessary evil that kept things orderly. The rules were strict but fair, she told herself. Trash bins had to be hidden from sight, lawns trimmed to a certain height, and exterior colors approved by the board. It all seemed reasonable, until small things began to feel strangely personal. It started with a letter, polite, but firm. Your garden trellis exceeds the approved height limit by 2 inches. Please correct this within 10 days to avoid penalty. Laura laughed at first, assuming it was a clerical error. But when she lowered the trellis, another letter arrived. This time about the color of her shutters being too faded to align with community standards, and then another questioning the placement of her backyard compost bin. The tone grew colder each time, and though the violations were minor, the message was clear. Someone was watching. During a community meeting, Laura caught Karen's gaze for the first time. A glance that lingered a beat too long, sharp and assessing. When Laura raised her concerns about the letters, the room went still. Karen smiled politely, her voice honey-sweet, but loaded with unspoken challenge. "We simply want to maintain the beauty of our neighborhood, Mrs. Bennett. I'm sure you understand." The others nodded in robotic unison. It was the first moment Laura felt like she didn't belong. Weeks passed. The petty notices continued. Lawn height, paint color, fence design. Each detail scrutinized with unsettling precision. Neighbors began to avoid eye contact. Conversations that once flowed easily grew shorter, cautious. There was a shift in the air, invisible but heavy. It was as if the entire community was performing, terrified of stepping out of line. Then came the incident with the mailbox. One morning, Laura found it slightly tilted, as though someone had kicked it in the night. A day later, she received a violation notice claiming it was improperly installed and had to be replaced to meet HOA standards. That was when her unease turned to suspicion. She started to wonder if the board's goal wasn't just order, but control. Pam Lane, ever the neighborhood gossip, would stop by sometimes with her forced smile. "You know how Karen is," she'd whisper. "She just likes things perfect. You'll get used to it." But the way Pam's eyes darted toward the street whenever she spoke told Laura otherwise. Nobody dared challenge Karen. Not openly. Inside her home, Laura tried to keep things normal. She worked from her sunlit office, baked on weekends, and tended to her garden. But even in her sanctuary, she felt watched. Once, while pruning her roses, she spotted Karen's car slowly cruising past. Not once, but twice. Another time, Greg knocked on her door, just to check her fence measurements. There was always an excuse, always a reason. But underneath the politeness was something colder, something deliberate. Still, she refused to give in. She repainted her shutters, trimmed her hedges, even reinstalled the mailbox exactly as they demanded. She followed every rule down to the letter, waiting for the harassment to stop. But instead, the board grew bolder. They began citing her for things that weren't even in the guidelines. Unapproved decoration, excessive exterior lighting, non-standard plant arrangement. It was absurd, and isolating. Neighbors she once waved to now crossed the street when they saw her. Children who played in her yard no longer stopped by. The friendliness of Willow Creek had vanished, replaced by whispers and silence. It wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about power, and Laura was becoming the board's new example. Late one evening, she heard a knock at her door. It was Steve Daniels, the quiet board member. His face was pale, uneasy. He spoke softly, eyes shifting toward the street. "Laura, you should be careful. Some things around here aren't what they seem." Then he left, disappearing into the night, before she could ask what he meant. That was the first real crack in the illusion of Willow Creek's perfection. Laura began to dig, not literally at first. She reviewed HOA documents, meeting notes, and past complaints. And what she found made her stomach drop. Patterns. Families who'd left suddenly after conflicts with the board. Homes foreclosed. People ostracized. It wasn't coincidence. It was control through fear. The next morning, she looked out her window at the neighborhood she once adored. The same lawns, the same fences, the same air of peace. But now she could see it for what it really was, a stage built on intimidation, run by people who wore civility like a mask. And she realized, whatever game the board was playing, she had unknowingly stepped into its center. But Laura Bennett wasn't the type to back down. She had built her life through resilience, and she wasn't about to let 5 people in a conference room destroy it. Still, As the days grew quieter and the nights more uneasy, she couldn't shake the question that kept echoing in her mind. How far would they go to keep her silent? Because deep down, she sensed it. This was only the beginning. At first, Laura Bennett tried to reason with them. She told herself the HOA's letters were just misunderstandings, administrative errors, or maybe someone being overly zealous about the rules. But soon it became clear that this was no coincidence. What began as a trickle of notices turned into a flood of demands, each one more absurd and condescending than the last. Every morning she dreaded the sound of her mailbox's metal flap, because that sound no longer meant bills or letters. It meant another accusation, another warning, another fine. The next violation came after she replaced her mailbox. It was identical to the one approved in the HOA's catalog, down to the model number. But Karen's latest letter claimed it was slightly off-center and did not align with the visual symmetry expected of Birchwood Lane. Laura laughed out loud when she read it, a bitter, exhausted laugh. Off-center? She muttered to herself. It's a mailbox, not the Taj Mahal. But then came the fine, $200. And when she refused to pay, they added late fees. By the end of the month, it had grown to nearly $500. She appealed the charges, submitting photos and measurements to prove her compliance. The board's reply was clinical and cold. Your appeal has been reviewed and denied. Continued non-payment may result in a lien on your property. That was the first time Laura's hands trembled, reading their words. The HOA could actually take her home over a mailbox. What made it worse was the neighborhood itself. The people she had once shared smiles and small talk with began to turn distant, wary. When she walked her dog, conversations would hush mid-sentence. One morning, she caught her neighbor, Mrs. Wheeler, peeking through her blinds as Laura watered her plants. When their eyes met, Mrs. Wheeler ducked out of sight. It was as if Laura had become contagious. The problem homeowner, the one everyone whispered about but no one helped. Soon, even the smallest parts of her daily life began to feel like battles. The HOA demanded she repaint her shutters again, claiming the color appeared inconsistent in certain lighting. Another letter accused her of violating noise ordinances after she used her lawnmower on a Saturday morning. The same day, half the neighborhood did the same. The hypocrisy was maddening, but no one else seemed to notice. Or worse, no one dared to. Then came the landscaping dispute. Greg, the treasurer, sent her a typed notice accompanied by a photo of her flower bed. It read, "Your garden contains non-compliant plant species. Only HOA-approved flora are permitted." Laura stared at the picture, dumbfounded. They were talking about her tulips. Tulips! Flowers she'd planted in memory of her late mother. When she attended the next board meeting to protest, Karen smiled that same thin, painted smile. "Rules are rules, Mrs. Bennett," she said softly, leaning forward. "We must maintain uniformity. I'm sure your mother would understand." That moment broke something inside Laura. The cruelty of it, the cold, calculated cruelty, burned in her chest. She went home shaking with anger, swearing she wouldn't let them win. But the harder she pushed back, the harder they pushed too. Within weeks, the HOA escalated again. They hired inspectors to evaluate compliance around her property. Strangers in polos and clipboards roamed her yard, taking photos of her windows, her patio, even her dog's water bowl. She confronted one of them, demanding to know who authorized this. "The board," he said simply, before walking away. That night, she sat in her kitchen staring at the stack of letters piling on the counter. She began keeping them in a shoebox, her growing archive of absurdity, a physical record of her torment. Then the gossip started. Pam Lane, who once chatted cheerfully about gardening, began spreading rumors. At the grocery store, Laura overheard her whispering to another neighbor. "She's unstable, you know, always picking fights. I heard she even threatened Karen." When Laura confronted her, Pam smiled sweetly. "Oh, honey, you must have misheard. Everyone's just concerned about you." But the damage was done. Her reputation in Willow Creek was quietly, systematically being dismantled. The HOA found new ways to suffocate her. They fined her for having a wind chime that was audible beyond property boundaries. They warned her about unapproved yard decor, a small ceramic frog by her flower bed. They accused her of leaving her trash bins out for too long, even though collection times had changed that week. Each new letter was like a knife, cutting away at her sense of peace, her sanity. Her job began to suffer too. Between phone calls to lawyers, tense emails, and sleepless nights, her work performance dipped. Her boss noticed. Friends stopped inviting her out. Even her own sister told her maybe she should just move. But it wasn't that simple. This was her home, her dream, and she refused to be bullied out of it. The board's tactics grew more personal. One morning, she found a note on her windshield. "Why don't you just leave? You don't belong here." There was no signature, but Laura didn't need one. She could feel Karen's presence behind every word. That night, she installed security cameras around her home. A part of her hated the paranoia, but another part knew it was justified. A week later, the cameras caught something, a shadowy figure moving near her fence just after midnight. The person crouched, then disappeared. The next morning, a fresh violation notice arrived. Fence panels uneven. Immediate correction required. It was no longer coincidence. Someone was sabotaging her property. Desperation began to take root. She started documenting everything, every notice, every photograph, every conversation. She filed complaints with the county, wrote letters to the state housing authority, even reached out to local reporters. But no one seemed to care. "It's a civil matter," one official told her. "You'll have to resolve it internally, with the same people tormenting her." Meanwhile, the board's meetings became increasingly hostile. When she attended to challenge her latest fine, Karen would address her with syrupy condescension. "Mrs. Bennett, we appreciate your passion for community standards," she'd say, "but your behavior continues to draw unnecessary attention." Each meeting ended the same way, Homeowners, with Laura storming out, shaking with frustration, while the board members exchanged smug, knowing looks. The few neighbors who still spoke to her did so in whispers. "Be careful," one said. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Another confided, "There was a family on Maple Drive. They left after the HOA started targeting them too. Their house sold fast, but not before they lost everything." The words stuck with her, cold and heavy. Then came the special assessment letter, a formal demand for $3,200 to cover community improvements. But Laura discovered that most of those improvements didn't exist. When she requested a breakdown of expenses, the board refused to provide one. She began to suspect something deeper than harassment, corruption. So she started digging again. She combed through public records, old HOA budgets, and past meeting minutes. What she uncovered made her blood run cold. The HOA had quietly increased dues over the years, but no one could trace where the extra funds had gone. Signatures on some of the meeting records didn't even match the listed attendees. And Karen's husband, a local contractor, had received several lucrative maintenance contracts from the board. It was bigger than petty power games. It was a racket, and Laura had become a threat to their perfect system. The moment they realized she was investigating, the retaliation exploded. Her water meter was tampered with, causing an astronomical bill. A citation arrived accusing her of unauthorized alterations to her front yard, even though she hadn't changed a thing. One night, her security camera feed froze, and by morning, one of her garden lights was smashed. She filed a police report, but the officer's words were hollow. "Without proof, there's not much we can do." Proof. That became her obsession. She stayed up late, cross-referencing invoices, printing copies of emails, highlighting suspicious transactions. She had enough evidence to expose them. But she needed the final piece, something irrefutable. That's when she decided to record the next HOA meeting. It was a humid Thursday night when she walked into the clubhouse with a discreet recorder hidden in her bag. The atmosphere was colder than ever. Karen sat at the head of the table, her expression tight. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, voice calm but sharp, "we're here to address your continued violations and refusal to comply with association standards." Laura took a deep breath, steadying her voice. "No, we're here to address your misconduct, the misuse of HOA funds, the harassment, the intimidation." The room went still. Greg shifted in his seat. "Those are serious accusations," he muttered. Karen didn't flinch. "You're treading on dangerous ground, Laura." But Laura didn't back down. "You've been using community money for personal gain." "I have proof." "Every dollar, every fake invoice," Pam gasped, whispering something to Robert. Steve, the quiet one, looked at Laura with a flicker of sympathy, then quickly glanced away. Karen's expression hardened. "I'd be very careful," she said, her voice dropping. "Accusations like that can have consequences." That night, Laura drove home with her heart pounding. The recording was clear. She had everything she needed. But as she pulled into her driveway, she noticed something strange. Her porch light was on, even though she had turned it off that morning. Inside, the living room curtain swayed gently as if someone had just moved it. Her stomach twisted. She grabbed her phone, calling out, "Hello!" No answer. The house was empty. But on her kitchen table lay a single piece of paper. It wasn't a letter this time. Just a handwritten note. "You should have stopped." Laura froze. For the first time, she truly felt fear. Not anger, not frustration, but fear. Someone had been inside her home. The walls that once felt safe now closed in around her. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every creak, every shadow made her flinch. She sat awake on the couch, clutching her phone, staring at the dark window. Somewhere out there, they were watching. She knew it. The next morning, she called the police again. And once again, they dismissed her concerns. Probably a prank, they said. But deep down, she knew better. The board had crossed a line. Still, Laura refused to back down. She uploaded copies of her evidence to a secure drive, contacted a journalist again, and began preparing to expose everything. She didn't realize yet that she had already triggered something irreversible, that the board wasn't going to let her story come to light without a fight. Because in Willow Creek, order wasn't maintained by rules. It was maintained by fear, and Laura Bennett had just declared war on the people who built it, and someone, somewhere, was already planning how to silence her for good. Climax, the morning of the final HOA meeting, felt different. The air was thick, charged, as if the entire neighborhood could sense what was about to happen. The sun rose through a haze that painted the roofs gold and copper, but Laura Bennett barely noticed. She hadn't slept in 2 days. Every hour she replayed the threats, the fines, the warnings, and that final note, "You should have stopped." But now she wasn't afraid. She was done running. Everything had built to this moment, and she had a plan that would finally turn the tide. Her house was a fortress of evidence. Every letter cataloged, every fine documented, every video file saved and backed up to 3 different drives. On her laptop sat a neatly organized folder labeled HOA Corruption, Proof. She stared at it for a long moment before copying it to a flash drive and tucking it into her pocket. Her hands were trembling, but her resolve was unshakable. The meeting that night wasn't just another confrontation. It was the culmination of months of abuse, lies, and intimidation. The HOA board had summoned her under the pretense of a final disciplinary hearing, though everyone in Willow Creek knew what it really was, a public execution. Karen Holloway wanted to humiliate her, to make an example of the woman who dared to fight back. Flyers had even gone out around the neighborhood. Community compliance hearing, homeowner Laura Bennett to address ongoing violations. By 6 o'clock, the clubhouse was packed. Neighbors filled every chair, whispering among themselves. Some looked curious, others hostile, but most just wanted to see a show. Karen sat at the head of the long oak table, flanked by her loyal lieutenants. Greg, Pam, Robert, and Steve. They looked smug, composed, like predators waiting for the kill. When Laura entered, the room fell silent. Her footsteps echoed across the polished floor. She carried a binder thick with documents, her camera discreetly pinned to her bag strap. Every detail was being recorded. She met Karen's gaze and didn't look away. "Mrs. Bennett," Karen began, her tone clipped and professional, "thank you for attending. As you know, this hearing concerns your continued disregard for community bylaws, your refusal to pay fines, and your hostile conduct toward board members." Laura placed her binder on the table. "Hostile conduct?" she repeated softly. "Interesting choice of words," Karen smiled thinly. "This isn't a debate. The board has already voted to proceed with property lien measures. Tonight is a formality, gasps, rippled through the room. Aline. It was the final threat made real, the power to take her home. Laura's jaw clenched, but she kept her composure. A formality? She said quietly. Then let's make it formal. She opened the binder. Because I have evidence. Evidence that this board has violated its own charter, misused community funds, and falsified enforcement notices. The board members shifted uncomfortably. Greg leaned toward Karen, whispering something, but she raised a hand to silence him. Mrs. Bennett, these baseless accusations have been noted. This is not the time— Oh, I think it is, Laura interrupted. Her voice rang clear, steady. You want to talk about bylaws? Let's talk about Article 14, Section 3. All expenditures must be publicly disclosed and approved by majority vote. You've violated that repeatedly. The contractor payments to Holloway Property Services, that's your husband's company, isn't it? The room stirred. Karen's face stiffened. That's irrelevant, she said sharply. We hired the most qualified firm. You hired your husband, Laura shot back, and funneled thousands of dollars of community dues into personal accounts. I have copies of the invoices, signed by you, approved without a vote. And you used falsified violation reports to silence anyone who questioned you. Now the murmurs turned into open whispers. A few neighbors looked visibly uneasy. Steve, who had always been quiet, dropped his pen. Karen's face flushed crimson. You're lying, she hissed. You're delusional. Laura's voice trembled slightly, but not from fear. Then maybe you can explain this. She took out her phone, connected it to the projector, and played the recording from the last meeting. The speakers crackled. Then came Karen's voice, cold, unmistakable. You're treading on dangerous ground, Laura. Then Greg's reply. We can't have her digging into the budget. Then Karen again. Lower, sharper. Then we'll make her stop. The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the ceiling lights, the faint whir of the projector fan. Karen stood frozen, her face drained of color. Greg's mouth hung open. Laura turned slowly toward the audience. They've used this HOA as a weapon, to intimidate, to extort, to control. Every fine, every citation, every rule was part of a system designed to protect their own power. And when I refused to bend, they tried to destroy me. A murmur spread, louder this time. Someone in the back muttered, She's right. Another voice added, I got fined for something similar. Karen slammed her hand on the table. Enough! This is a private matter. Mrs. Bennett is no longer welcome in this community. Laura straightened. You don't get to decide that anymore. She reached into her pocket and held up the flash drive. Everything I just showed, and more, has already been sent to the county auditor, the state attorney's office, and the local news. They'll have it by morning. For the first time, Karen looked genuinely afraid. You can't do that, she stammered. You're violating— I'm exposing you, Laura said firmly. And I'm not alone anymore. She turned toward the audience, her neighbors, the ones who had avoided her for months. How many of you have been fined unfairly, threatened with liens, told to stay silent? A few hands went up, then more. A wave of quiet outrage rippled through the crowd. This isn't about me, she said. It's about all of us. They've been hiding behind rules to keep us afraid. But the moment we stop being afraid, they lose. Karen rose abruptly, trying to reassert control. This meeting is adjourned. She shouted. Everyone out, but no one moved. Even Greg and Pam looked uncertain now. Robert mumbled something about calling a lawyer. Steve leaned back in his chair, staring down at the table, shame flickering across his face. The silence that followed was electric. Laura took a slow breath, feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Power. Real power. You wanted a show, Karen? She said quietly. Then let's finish it. As she gathered her papers, Karen lunged forward, slapping the binder off the table. Pages scattered across the floor like falling leaves. The crowd gasped. Laura froze for a heartbeat, then stooped to pick them up. When she straightened, she looked Karen dead in the eye. That was your last mistake. 2 days later, the storm truly hit. The county launched an immediate investigation. Journalists arrived at Willow Creek, cameras in hand, asking questions no one wanted to answer. The local paper ran a front-page story. Homeowners accuse HOA of fraud and harassment. Laura's name was everywhere. For the first time, her story was being heard and believed. But the HOA didn't crumble quietly. Karen fought back with everything she had left. She filed a defamation claim accusing Laura of slander and damaging community reputation. She called emergency meetings, rallied loyalists, and even tried to discredit Laura online. But the more she fought, the more the truth bled through. Emails surfaced, financial records leaked, even Steve came forward, admitting that he'd been pressured into signing blank budget approvals. The evidence was overwhelming. Within weeks, the board was suspended pending investigation. Karen's husband's company was subpoenaed for fraudulent billing, and Karen herself, the Queen of Willow Creek, found herself cornered. Laura should have felt victorious, but instead she felt hollow. The adrenaline that had fueled her for months began to drain away, leaving behind exhaustion and disbelief. She walked through her house, her home, touching the walls that had witnessed every moment of her battle. The mailbox, the garden, the fence, symbols of the war she never asked for but refused to lose. Still, the nightmare wasn't quite over. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Laura heard footsteps outside. She looked through her window and saw Karen standing at the end of her driveway. Her hair was disheveled, her expression unrecognizable, a mix of rage and desperation. "What do you want?" Laura called out through the door. Karen didn't move. "You ruined everything," she said finally, her voice shaking. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Laura stepped onto the porch. "I stopped you," she said simply. For a moment, Karen just stood there, trembling. Then her shoulders slumped. "It was never supposed to go this far," she whispered. "You just wouldn't give up." "No," Laura said quietly, "because you were wrong." Karen turned and walked away, her figure fading into the shadows of the cul-de-sac. It was the last time Laura ever saw her. Days later, an official notice arrived. The HOA board had been dissolved. A new interim committee, composed of homeowners, would oversee operations until new elections. Fines and liens were voided. Every trace of the Holloway's influence was scrubbed clean. The kingdom Karen built on fear had finally collapsed. When the news broke, the neighborhood changed almost overnight. People who once avoided Laura now waved from across the street. Mrs. Wheeler even brought her a pie, stammering apologies. "We were scared," she said. "You were brave." Brave, the word didn't feel right. Laura hadn't felt brave when she was alone, sobbing at midnight, or when she'd found that threatening note on her table. She'd just been desperate to reclaim the piece of her life they had stolen. But maybe that's what courage really was, refusing to give in. Even when fear became the air you breathed, the story spread far beyond Willow Creek. It sparked debates about HOAs, about abuse of power, about the line between order and control. Reporters called her the homeowner who fought back. She didn't care for the title, but she couldn't deny what it represented. Her small, quiet rebellion had become something larger, a symbol of resistance against people who believed they could bully others into silence. Months later, Laura stood in her yard again. The tulips had bloomed, bright and defiant. Her mailbox stood straight, her fence repaired, her peace restored. But every scar, every letter, every fine, every sleepless night was still part of her. She had lost so much, but she had reclaimed something greater, her voice. And yet, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the perfect lawns of Willow Creek, she couldn't help but wonder how many other communities still lived under the same quiet tyranny. How many others were too afraid to fight back? Because if there's one thing she learned, it's this: when power hides behind civility, when cruelty dresses itself as order, someone has to be brave enough to tear the mask off, no matter the cost. And as the last light faded over her peaceful street, Laura Bennett knew one truth would forever linger in the minds of those who had watched her story unfold. In the end, the rules didn't protect them. They only protected those who wrote them. When the storm finally broke, it didn't come with thunder or shouting. It came with silence. That strange, heavy silence that follows after something has been shattered beyond repair. The HOA office sat empty now. The once smug faces that had dictated every hedge height and mailbox color now vanished behind lawyer letters and board resignations. The neighborhood that had once bowed to their authority was finally beginning to wake up. It started quietly, whispers during morning walks, people slowing their cars near Laura's house to offer a small nod, a sympathetic wave, the kind that said, "We saw what they did, and we're sorry." For weeks after the confrontation, Laura moved through her days as if relearning what peace felt like. The letter that ended it all, the official statement declaring the HOA's dissolution after the fraud investigation, arrived one afternoon in a plain envelope. It wasn't dramatic, no confetti or fanfare, just a few typed lines and an embossed seal. But it might as well have been a declaration of freedom. The board had been found guilty of misusing community funds and violating homeowners' rights. The fines imposed on Laura were voided, the liens on her property erased, and her name finally cleared. But even more satisfying than that legal victory was the quiet transformation that began to ripple through the neighborhood. Houses that had long stood in compliance and fear now began to show little signs of individuality. Painted doors, wind chimes, even a garden gnome or two. People who had avoided eye contact for years now stopped to talk, to laugh, to remember what it was like to be part of a community instead of a controlled colony. Laura would often sit on her porch in the evenings, tea in hand, and watch kids ride their bikes again, without someone snapping photos or issuing warnings. It felt like the soul of the neighborhood had been returned to its rightful owners, but peace didn't come overnight. The scars were still there, letters from the HOA still tucked away in drawers, memories of humiliation still vivid. Some neighbors who had sided with the board now avoided her altogether, unable to face their own guilt. Others sought forgiveness, offering small gestures, fresh-baked cookies, help with gardening, quiet apologies whispered over fences. Laura didn't hold grudges. She had learned that vengeance, while satisfying, doesn't rebuild a life. Truth does. Her victory reached farther than she imagined. Local news picked up the story, framing it as an example of standing up to corrupt HOAs. Lawyers reached out, community leaders invited her to speak, and soon her name became synonymous with resilience. She never intended to become a symbol, but the story had taken on a life of its own. People from other neighborhoods began to write her, sharing their own battles, their own fear of boards that had turned into bullies. And each message reminded her that this wasn't just about one house or one woman. It was about countless others trapped in systems built on fear and control. Even the board members faced consequences. The former president, Karen Holloway, was fined heavily for misappropriating community funds and later barred from holding any similar position. Her once perfect facade crumbled as the community she ruled turned against her. The treasurer lost his real estate license, and the property management company that had enabled their tactics dropped the HOA from its portfolio entirely. One by one, the pillars of their small empire collapsed, not with drama, but with justice. For the first time in years, the sound of laughter drifted across the cul-de-sac again. Holiday decorations returned. The fences once marked by violations now glowed with string lights and color. The air felt lighter. Laura's home, once a symbol of defiance, became the heart of the neighborhood's rebirth. She planted sunflowers along her walkway, not as a statement, but as a quiet celebration, a promise that even after years of darkness, things could bloom again. In the months that followed, Laura found herself reflecting on everything she had endured, the endless letters, the fines, the anxiety that kept her awake at night. She realized that the battle had changed her. It had stripped away her fear, hardened her resolve, and reminded her that silence in the face of injustice only feeds its power. She had faced manipulation, isolation, and humiliation, but in the end, she stood taller because of it. The neighborhood, once rigid and lifeless, began hosting small gatherings again. There were block parties, potlucks, and Sunday evening bonfires. People spoke freely, laughed without fear, and took pride in their homes not because they met a rulebook standard, but because they finally felt like theirs. The HOA's absence had restored something intangible, a sense of belonging, of ownership, of freedom. Late one evening, as the sun set behind the rows of rooftops, Laura sat on her porch swing. the same one she once received a violation notice for installing without permission. The soft creak of the wood, the smell of jasmine in the air, it all felt different now. She thought about the long nights when she wanted to give up, the days when every letter from the HOA felt like another nail in her spirit. But if she hadn't fought back, if she hadn't stood her ground, none of this peace would exist. And then came the most unexpected part. Karen, the former HOA president, showed up one afternoon. She looked older, her confidence replaced by something brittle and raw. She didn't come with excuses, just a quiet, "I'm sorry." Laura didn't know what to say at first. The memory of everything Karen had done still echoed between them, the humiliation, the threats, the fines. But looking at her now, standing on the same porch where she once delivered ultimatums, Laura realized that forgiveness wasn't about letting someone off the hook. It was about freeing yourself from the weight of the past. She nodded, accepted the apology, and closed the door behind her with peace, not bitterness. The seasons changed and time softened the sharp edges of the past. The community thrived again, this time without hierarchy or fear. New homeowners arrived, unaware of the war that had once torn the place apart. But they inherited a neighborhood reborn through struggle. The bylaws that once dictated every blade of grass were rewritten collectively.